Mainstream literature draws us to the attention on violence. The transition from conflict to violence as characterizing African conflicts. And that becomes the central debate, how African conflicts degenerate into violence. See this captured in the media, what we would call mediatized picture of violence. And the violence is so spectacular that it borders vulgarity, what we would call vulgar violence. The cutting of the lips, the cutting of amputations, rape, a woman's breast cut off, and next week we are going to watch a movie on this. And in a sense, it draws us to the big question of first, the intensity of violence in African conflicts. And at the same time, as we look to the intensity, it also brings to the attention the degenerate nature of conflict in Africa. And as a result, there's a tendency to suggest that African conflicts are unnecessarily primitive, unnecessarily barbaric, and so it has less utility, less value, and therefore less understood and less appreciated. And how were we to understand conflict? There is a mainstream literature that provides us a framework of understanding conflicts. That conflicts must happen because there is a disagreement, specifically on interests and goals. So what are these interests? From political science, the interest is a power. And so there is a disagreement who should hold power, who should retain power. From an economic point, it is a resource. There is a disagreement on allocation of resource, who owns or who gets how much, and on and on. The question of identity in anthropology, the question of institutions and structures in sociology, and on and on. And most of African conflicts do not fit within this categorization. And instead of focusing on the issues to which a conflict or a war as ensued, it degenerates to violence, and violence can no longer be understood. So today we want to think a little bit about this idea of violence in African conflicts. Already we also did mention that whereas this is not withstanding the phenomenon and the empirical data on violence in Africa, there is also an intense viewing of African violence from a particular lens, from a colonial lens. That the people we colonize, as we told you, were already barbaric and primitive. So violence is only an expression of what we told you. And then there is also a pre-colonial tendency that, well, we had structured the system, and the system was a lot more stable. We brought some sanity. But independence and our going away, the colonial master would suggest our going away has reintroduced this barbarity and primitivity. So you see the collapse of the institutions we built. You see the collapse of the structures. And you see the collapse of human relations, social relations, into the violence you are seeing. So a number of perspectives have been offered to identify, mark, and profile the violence in Africa. The conclusion is it is an expression of some chaotic order that is not explainable. Or if it is explainable from the point of barbarity, from the point of uncivil behavior towards war. Because war must have some laws, wars must have some regulations. And if we simply destroy these laws and regulations or rules, it simply tells us what we are, that we are lawless, we are chaotic, and that borders primitivity. A lot of conversation. But violence, as expressed in African conflicts, should not necessarily be swept or generalized as an expression of barbarity or primitivity. We want to say that yes, it is spectacular, but it is thinkable. It is vulgar, but we have to think through. And we cannot think through by generalizing it as an expression of a primitivity. And as a result, this morning we want to shift from the colonial interpretation of violence in Africa, and we also want to shift from the post-colonial interpretation of violence in Africa, and we want to look at violence as an academic field. We want to look at violence as a theoretical field. And so we are moving it away, as we said, from the colonial, from the post-colonial, and look at violence from the social theory. So we want to talk about the social theory of violence. Why? Because once we start talking about the social theory of violence, we are moving away from the colonial mainstream and categorization and analysis of violence in African conflict from post-colonial, but also in a sense a shift from the statist notion and then begin to look at the violence from a particular point, the point what we are calling the social theory of violence. And the idea of the social theory of violence starts to help us to focus a little bit. That the issue is not violence. So our categorization process of violence must not start with violence itself. Our interpretation of violence must not start with the phenomenon of violence. But we must begin to ask the question, how do we explain violence? Not from the perspective of its empirical presence. Not from its empirical presence, not from its factual presence, that yes, we see lots of violence. But from a domain we are calling a theorizing domain. And that is the social theory of violence. Meaning, therefore, that when we are looking at how conflicts and wars descend into violence, if we have to understand violence, we should not look at the act of prosecuting war. We should not look at the act of prosecuting violence. But we have to look at the origin of violence, the genealogy of violence. I don't know whether we understand that. Yes, we see the machete. We see the cutting of the lips. We see the cutting of the ears. That is what we are calling the prosecuting of violence. And when we limit our analysis to the prosecution of violence as it is, then we miss the point. We need to move beyond what our eyes see as the prosecuting of violence. We need to move beyond what we experience as the prosecuting of violence, beyond the physical state of violence, to the basis on which violence grows. What is this foundation to which violence has grown that we can now see? What is this motivation from which violence is physically expressed? In other words, tracing the origin of violence. the genealogy of violence in Africa. How do we trace the origin of violence? Because one who is violent must have been nurtured into violence. So instead of looking at the violence, let us look at the nurturing into violence. And our starting conversation is from a two-angling of the same person, Irene Anna. Anna Arendt writes a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann, or Adolf Eichmann, was a military officer of a high rank. Others say lieutenant colonel, others say colonel. In whatever variations, we want to stabilize his rank as a lieutenant colonel in the Nazi regime with Adolf Hitler. And his role was part of the issue of the final solution. Final solution. And what was the final solution? That the problem of the day was a result of the Jews. And so we must annihilate the Jews. This is the concept of genocide. We must kill all the Jews because they are our problem. And how is it a final solution? It's a final solution in a sense that when we kill all the Jews, we shall rest. And that brought the concept of the Auschwitz. Auschwitz. The final solution, the annihilation, the killing of the Jews. And a number of the Jews were rounded up, both in Germany and in Eastern Europe and the entire Europe, into the concentration camps to be killed. And all this was notoriously named as Auschwitz, the final solution, the killing, the genocide against the Jews. But it was not only the Jews, it was also the Russians, what was called Russian gulags, which was an equivalent of the Auschwitz. And in the gulags, it was a slave labor camp. You work until the last bone collapses. Building roads, building rails, building factories, building industries, and all of that. The Russian. Because the assumption was that the Russians and the entire Eastern Europe were not really humans. In a sense, they were not the superior race, they are inferior race. And so they were to be committed to hard labor, slave labor. All of them, the common point was genocide. Genocide. So, first is you have Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, quite central in this process. The killing of, the Russians, all these Eastern European, races, including the Jews, because they are considered less human. So the point is genocide. And Eichmann did that commendably, but as it were, when Nazism collapsed, Hitler is defeated around 1945. Eichmann ran to Argentina to hide because now the system has collapsed. He runs to Argentina to hide. Hitler is defeated, Nazism is defeated. But because he had killed Jews to that amount, the Israeli intelligence, how are they called? Mossad, looked for him. It took a while, but not forever. They got him. And he was arrested and brought to Jerusalem. And that's why we're saying Eichmann in Jerusalem, to stand trial for what he did. And the story is, after the trial, he was committed to death sentence. But in between, Anna Arendt, who was a German Jew, narrowly escaped from Germany and escaped to USA, now decided to write for the New Yorker as a journalist. And so he goes to cover, the court proceedings, the hearing against Eichmann. In her view, as she is coming to the court, she had a very particular view about Eichmann. If Eichmann can send thousands and millions of people to their death, it must be OBB. It must be an Hydra. It must be such a fearsome character. It probably may not look like a human being. It must be a lion, something awful. But to her surprise, as she entered each time to the courtroom, she finds Eichmann in a tie, in a court, and speaks like a gentleman. He behaves like a gentleman. He quotes books. He cites books as a defense for what he did. And Anna now realizes that there is a problem here. It does not look like OBB or Hydra or this terrifying, lion. But his composure, looking smart, looking civilized, becomes terrifying. He is terrifyingly normal. Now, why is he terrifyingly normal? He is so normal that I begin to fear. What is it that made this normal man kill? What is it that made this normal man send thousands and millions of people to their death? How can we understand this? He is in a tie and in a coat. He is normal. He is ordinary. But he killed many. So where's the problem? And Anna Arendt realizes that the crime of Eichmann was not the killing of the people. Yes, he has killed. But that's not the crime. The crime of Eichmann was thoughtlessness. Being thoughtless. Not questioning. Not thinking through what he's doing. He was thoughtless, simply following commands. He was part of a movement that was simply moving. A movement that is simply moving. We go, we go, we go, we go, we go, we go. Where are we going? To kill the Jews. We go, we go, we go, we go, we go. Can't you pause a moment and think through? No. So, Arendt Anna says that the problem of Eichmann was not the killing. His crime is not the killing. His crime is being thoughtless. So the problem of thoughtlessness, but we are going to historicize thoughtlessness. He is thoughtless. He's not thinking through what he's doing. He's simply doing it without thinking through. Thoughtless. But why was he thoughtless? Because he was following orders. It was a routine. Killing of Jews was not a problem. Just like killing of the Tutsis was not a problem. We go, we go, we go, we go, we go. You just go. You are in a movement of we go. That is simply moving. We go, boom, 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 boom. Mami, I'm not for charity. What is the work? I'm going to work. What is the work? Killing of the Tutsis. It's work. And after breakfast, after porridge, off with other youth. You are in a group. Moving. We go, we go, we go, we go. And a movement that is simply moving, that group psychology destroys thinking and you become thoughtless. Anna Arendt therefore asked, What made Eichmann thoughtless? What made Eichmann thoughtless is a movement that is simply moving, that's number one. The two is bureaucratization. Like a good officer that follows order, like a good officer that follows command, Eichmann suffered from the problem of bureaucracy. Most of us would always argue the boss made an instruction that somebody should be fired, and I fired the person. But the procedure of firing a person was wrong. Couldn't you see? Then you say, well, I saw, but I was under instruction to fire. Couldn't you see that the money you were spending for buying something should have gone through a procurement process? Oh yeah, I knew. Why didn't you follow the procurement process? I was instructed by the boss. Bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy creates a hierarchy. And as you are a subordinate, you must listen to the superior. So that was also an argument of Eichmann that, look, I have to listen to the bosses. So, Arendt says that the problem of Eichmann, the crime Eichmann committed was not the killing itself. This killing had an origin. This killing has an origin. This killing has an origin. And the origin is not the killing itself. The origin is that the process of a movement simply moving, and the process of bureaucratization made Eichmann thoughtless and descended like a killer machine. And because of this, Hannah Arendt therefore says, to understand violence, to understand crime, don't look at the crime, look at the origin. To understand a character, to understand a person killing to that magnitude, do not understand the person, do not understand the killing, but understand the origin of this person, the origin of the killing. So Hannah Arendt goes into theorizing the corpus of Holocaust, the corpus of genocide, the corpus of killing. Where can we locate violence? Where can we locate genocide? Where can we locate Eichmann? And Hannah Arendt looked at genocide, as Eichmann caused it, from the history of genocide, from the origin of genocide. And as we said, we are going to look at the social theory of violence. In other words, when you're looking at the social theory of violence, you do not see the violence in the war, but you want to see the origin of the violence in the war. And looking at the history of genocide, Hannah Arendt locates genocide in Germany within the historical continuum. Hannah Arendt begins to notice that even the character of Eichmann was not something of the day, it was something of history. So that Eichmann's behavior must be plotted in the historical trajectory. And so it goes into how the history of genocide had been long stretched. So that then when the Nazi, Hitler, Eichmann conducted the genocide, they were simply part of the long history of genocide tendency. And we want to look at the genocide as a moment of violence in a war. It can be maiming, it can be killing, It can be read whatever we can name as violence. We are using genocide to, in a sense, give us a comparative study of how violence has an historical source, an historical origin. And Hannah Arendt begins to locate Holocaust or a genocide in the history of genocide. And she realizes that the death of the Jews was not the starting point of genocide. The killing of the Jews by Eichmann was not only Eichmann who ever killed at that magnitude, but that the killing process, genocide, had happened in historical times. This time it was playing out on the Jews by Eichmann and the genocidal infrastructure of the time. And she says, earlier on, the Hottentots, or the Hottentots tribes, the Hereros in Namibia, were killed. The story tells us that literally the Hottentots and the Hereros in Southern Africa were annihilated because of the German genocide. So genocidality as a concept and as a behavior did not start with Eichmann. It has an history. And this is important because you got to understand how origin of certain behavior perpetuates itself, becomes durable. The second is in Congo. It is estimated that King Leopold found a Congolese population around 20 to 40 million, but that was reduced to only 8 million. What kind of genocide can that be? From 20 to 40 million just to 8 million. That was King Leopold. So you see how genocide is built over time as a character, as a behavior. And over time, when you do it the first time, you feel guilty. When you do it the second time, you feel less guilty. The third time becomes normal, and you become thoughtless. So thoughtlessness has an origin in the movement that is simply moving. And that was a colonial movement that was moving. That the colonized were inferior. They were less human. So they must be annihilated. They must be, victims of genocide. So it was a movement that was moving, except this time the movement also went to Europe. The British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, in the Royal Albert Hall speech of 4th May 1898 said, "The world is in two domains, the world of the living and the world of the dying." Now look, it did not say the world of the living and the world of the dead, but it said the world of the dying. So there are people that should be dying. There are a people that should be dying to give us way, to give us a space. So dying did not become scandalous anymore. It was a part of the process of a colonial establishment. So a movement that is moving. There are people who should live, and we are the people who should live. And there are people who should be dying. Not dead, but dying. And these are the so-called inferior race. These are the so-called colonized. So what is this? The idea of killing the lower races in the colonial mission. But as the Hereros were being killed, and as the Congolese were being killed, Hitler was 9 years old. So when Hitler now picks up the genocide against the Jews, was Hitler mad? No. Hitler was a part of the colonial mission of killing, except this time there was a reverse. It was not the colonized being killed, it was now Europeans killing themselves. The principle was kill, because there are people who should live and there are people who should be dying. The Tasmania Island that was the size of Ireland, was colonized by the British in 1803. But the last native, because of the massacres, because of the genocides, the last native died in 1869. So what was the approximate population of Tasmanian island? It is projected between 600,000 to 1 million. But in a span of less than 70 years, the last person dies, 1869. What have we done? We've wiped out the Tasmanian local indigenous inhabitants. What is that? Genocide.
So meaning there's no Tasman in the world?
As a country, Tasmanian island is there, but the regional indigenous people are not there. We've tried with Australia to wipe out the Aborigines, but a bit difficult. But we've reduced them to probably 10 to 15%. The people we found majority are now the minority. What happened to them? We decimated them. Where was the laws of war? Where was the laws of war? The laws of war applied only to the colonial masters among the so-called civilized race. And the laws of nature, the biological distinction or competition for the fittest, that applied to the indigenous. The law of nature. What is the law of nature? Survival for the fittest. He who is the fittest survives. So we see the colonial mission in Africa and how and what they did. And we saw that was colonial mission in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia. The mission was displacement through process of genocide and massacres. That is violence. But we also saw that there was a transition from massacring Africans, massacring the colonized people, and now the concept of a massacre, the concept of genocide also penetrated back at Europe. And that is the Auschwitz, the killing of the Jews, or the anti-Semitic, killing of the Jews, and also the Russian gulags as, a slave labor camp. So we see the original conversation is genocide method on African peoples or the colonized people. The second point is the Nazi killing the Jews. So what does that mean? We have two intersections here. One, the genocide on the Jews, that is the genocide on the Jews tradition, and the tradition of genocide on the colonized people. Hitler applied to Europe what Europe applied to Africa. And that was the problem of Hitler. How do you kill us? It was the colonized who should be killed. How do you bring genocide to us? Genocide had been limited to the colonized. We went and massacred the Red Indians in America. What we call, the indigenous. We saw the British in Australia. We see the Germans in Namibia, the Hereros. We see the Belgian Leopold in Congo, massacring. What was the problem of Hitler? Hitler applied to Europe what Europe had applied to Africa. The concept of genocide. So how would you place Hitler? Was Hitler a murderer? Yes. But where is the crime of Hitler? The crime of Hitler is thoughtlessness as well. And why was Hitler thoughtless? Because Hitler was a part of a movement that was moving. And what was the movement? That we are the superior race. So when the British went to America, killed the Red Indians. When the British went to Australia, killed the Aborigines. When Germans went to Namibia, killed the Herreros. What was it? They were the inferior race. So similarly, the notion of the superior race and inferior race was the concept that Hitler picked. And so Hitler brought this narrative back to Europe. Who is the superior race? Us, the Aryans. And who is the inferior race? Is no longer the colonial African, but the Jew. And the killing was that much. But why was it easy to kill? Because it was a movement that was moving. Kill the inferior. Because we've been killing in Africa and nobody was killing. So all the inferiors must be killed. Now we've come back to Europe. Maybe they finished Africa. Now we are back to Europe. By the way, who is also inferior among us? And we start killing. Theoretically, you begin to see the origin of the violence. It's built on this idea of a movement that is moving. When we lose consciousness and we become thoughtless as a result of a movement that is simply moving. The categorization of the inferior and the superior. So when we come back to Africa, we are going also to notice that violence in Africa is not primitive. We must understand the historical content of violence. And this is what we are going into. Frantz Fanon. First of all, before we go to Frantz Fanon, genocide then in colonized people was possible because there was this language. Superior race, we the colonial master. The inferior race, the colonized. So, for the first time, the conversation entered into the mainstream. That is, somebody is superior, somebody is inferior. This was a colonial construct. The second was, we are the settlers, and you are the natives. And the identity of the settler and the native now is entrenched. For the first time, the settlers are killing and annihilating the natives. And we have history. We have a long history on how the settlers killed and massacred the natives. And at this point, Frantz Fanon comes and says, the natives must liberate themselves. The natives must liberate themselves from the settlers. The colonizers, the Europeans are the settlers. And if you do not liberate yourself, they will finish you. But what are they using to finish you? Violence. And so Frantz Fanon says you must also use violence against them to liberate yourself. At that point, Frantz Fanon is telling us violence is not primitivity. Violence is an instrument of liberation. That complicates the conversation. But there we are. Violence to be used by the colonized man, by the native, by the indigenous people to liberate themselves. So in this case, Frantz Fanon says, violence becomes a key to liberate. And in that case, violence is not irrational, but it is the way to go. Because the modern colonialism showed us that we were colonized through violence. And we were governed through violence. So violence is the modern logic of either being enslaved or liberating yourself. So you can use violence to enslave, but you can also use violence to liberate. And Frantz Fanon says it is not the Bible going to liberate you, because the modern logic has created the idea of a violence to enslave. And so you can use the same violence to liberate oneself. And once Frantz Fanon talks about violence to liberate yourself, meaning you are once enslaved, now you are using violence to liberate yourself. You were once the victim, now you are the killer. Do you understand that? You were once the victim, now you are the killer. So what happens when I get you killing? What happens when I'm seeing a war in Africa and the soldiers or the militias are killing? It is because one time they were victims. And Frantz Fanon says that victims must use violence to liberate themselves. And the victims are now using violence to kill the colonizer, to kill the settler, to kill the white man. And indeed, he has become a killer. But at what point can we understand that? Is that primitivity? No. That there is an origin to this killer. There is a history to this killer. This killer is not seeing killing. This killer is seeing liberation. Okay. And some of you can read my YouTube.
Yes.
Go to YouTube and Google comment. So basically, this in a sense summarizes the social theory of violence. That violence has an origin, violence has a history. And so we don't have to focus on the violence itself, but the origin of the violence. So when you see cutting of lips, a cutting of a mouth, that itself scandalizes, yes, but it is thinkable. And we have to think through drawing our attention to the genealogy of the history of the violence. Until we are able to reach there, we would simply sweep and generalize as awful, terrible, and primitive. So similarly, coming back to the spectacular manifestation of African violence should be understood from the origin, from the history. One of the core history is the colonial history. Where did we learn genocide from? From the colonial master. When now we begin to see a Tutsi and a Hutu killing each other. History tells us that in the minds of the Hutus, the Tutsis are settlers. They migrated all this while from Ethiopia or far beyond to Egypt and came and settled and found us. But they imposed themselves on us violently. And now Frantz Fanon does, so the violence is similar to the colonial violence of settling and colonizing, and expressing that the other is inferior. So, the story also suggests that Hutus think the history was that Tutsis thought they were more superior than the Hutus, and they were treated as such and killed as such. So now the native, the indigenous, the colonized must also deploy violence to liberate oneself. So when we see a Hutu now killing, cut the tall tree down, it has a history. A history that this time we're also using violence to liberate ourselves. So where is the problem? The problem is not violence itself. The problem is the history of the violence. And so we need to attend to this history and resolve this history without necessarily focusing on the current violence, because the current violence is only a symptom of a long history. When you're looking at the Karamojong cattle rustling, how is this? This is primitive. No. It is thinkable. It is bad, it is awful, but it is thinkable within the historical trajectory. Can we go into the history of cattle rustling? Can we go into the history to understand the origin of cattle rustling? And until we are there, we would simply see the cattle rustling now as primitive, and we generalize, and yet we've not understood the origin. If we see the cutting of the lips, the cutting of the nose, it is itself awful, but it is thinkable. It has a history. It has a genesis. The first cutting of lips and ears was not performed by an African, was performed by a white man against the colonized. The story of Congo is right. You've not tapped as much rubber as I need. Your hand is cut because you are assumed as lazy. And so, we are punishing you for being lazy. So, amputation is historical. We learned that a hand can be amputated from history of Congo, Leopold Congo. We learned that genocide, like genocide in Rwanda, 1994, maybe starting from 1993, 1994, was possible because the Germans used it against the Red. We learned that it is possible because Hitler used it. So the concept and the practice of genocide is not a spark, is not an event, it is a history. And so we need to understand the history of a genocide and how it has built a new consciousness. A consciousness that we are simply killing inferior people. We are simply killing a cockroach. We are simply killing an animal, not a human. It is long, straight history. Why is it now primitive when we are seeing it in Africa? Why is it now primitive when we see similar violence in Africa? Instead of calling it primitive, we should understand the origin. Because we had also to place Hitler within historical context of genocide studies, genocide history. When Lord Salisbury is talking about the world is divided between the living and the dying. And what does that mean, the dying? In other words, we should kill so that we continue living. Hitler was now born 9 years. He grew up in the environment that there are people living and there are people dying. And when Hitler did what he did, why is it a surprise to us? Was Hitler the first person to cause genocide? No. We know the genocide against the Red Indians in America, against the Aborigines. We've talked about Tasmania Island, and on and on and on and on. History is simply repeating itself. It's so much a characteristic of modern idea of politics. Modernity has created violence to that magnitude. And so when we see it expressed in Africa, when we see ethnic violence, why would a Yoruba in Nigeria kill an Igbo to a point of cutting the nose, cutting the ears, amputating the legs? Is it just violence we are seeing? No, there is history to this. We got to understand. Now, when we use the classical example of Uganda, 1972, Amin chases the Indians. And his accusation is that the Indians were milking the cow without feeding it. That is an economic violence. Was it awful? Yes, but thinkable in view of the origin of this chasing. 1966, what is called the Buganda crisis, when Obote had a personal grudge and a personal drama with the Kabaka of Buganda. In other words, assaulting Buganda. And we all know what happened. But was that awful? Yes, but thinkable within the historical container. Now, where is the history? Let's make that as an illustration. The social theory of violence in Uganda. When the colonial master came, 1900, we have the Buganda Agreement. And in this agreement, many things happened, but what is also important is Buganda was given a superior status. But maybe before we talk about that, 1900, the British now have a foothold in Uganda. But as it were, as the British continued colonizing and ruling Uganda, they created the race theory. Race, and then tribe, or ethnicity. Who was the race here? The race was the first race, and the first superior race was the British, or let's say the colonizer. And that was the British. But also after the British created another race after them, the Indians. Now, what about the ethnic groups? You had the natives. The natives. So the nativization of the British colony, the natives. But the natives was also hierarchical. On top of the natives were the Baganda. Buganda. Oh no, yes, Baganda. And then after them, others. Now, two things. One, because we were a race was governed by civil law. Tribes were governed by customary laws. Customary laws. I hope you're recording. This is beautiful. By customary laws. You have a problem? Law. You are an Indian, you go to the civil courts. Civil, criminal, and so forth. The customary. So, where is the problem? Problem number one. When the British left, before the British left, because the British or the colonizers were the race and Indians, they had privileges. Political privileges, economic privileges. The first speaker of parliament was an Indian. A number of things taken by the Indians. Businesses, Indians, all of these cooperative societies, the Indians were manning them because they were seen as a race, superior, and they felt superior and treated themselves as superior and looked down against the others. India, everywhere you're going is an Indian man. And because we are being told we are a very good race, now here we are, we've all got independence together. And then Ugandans, suddenly in 1972, Amin chases them. Why did Amin chase? When you see the chasing, how the Indians, some of them falling in the rivers to die, to commit suicide, because they had no any other place. Was Amin so bad? Yes, but the conduct of Amin was thinkable. And how is it thinkable? Because the Indians had too much privileges. And when he chased them, Ugandans celebrated. Were Ugandans also evil? No. There was an origin to this celebration. And where is the origin? For too long, they were considered the privilege. But notice, to date, other tribes are not comfortable with the Buganda. Why? Because even when they were framed as an ethnic group, the colonial master left Buganda as a superior ethnic group, a superior native against the others. And so used Buganda to extend the colonial boundary, the colonial frontier of the British, all over Uganda. And they were given the privileges. And so, you see the conflict between Obote and Mutesa or Buganda from the privileged point. Who are you? We are already superior, and the white man told us we are superior. For you, you are Lami, you are down. We cannot get instructions from you, but from the colonial master. But because the colonial master has left, we are not superior. We need our own Luchiko, our own parliament. So they created their own parliament. And we cannot accept to be part of Uganda until our Kabaka is the president, and on and on. And that could not stay for so long. 1966, there's a spark, there's violence. How do you understand? Was Obote so bad? No. Yes, Obote is bad, that conduct was bad, it was awful, but thinkable. Because then you needed to plot the origin of the Buganda 1966 crisis. And where is the origin? It's here. The next we can see is the constitutional crisis, the post-colonial constitutional crisis. Why we didn't know how to govern, and why didn't we know? Because civil law was not for us. Civil law upon which government rests was not with us, it was with the colonial master and the Indians. Ours was customary law. And what is customary law? What does your tribe say when somebody is a thief? What does your tribe say when you are marrying the third wife? What does your law say, your customs say? How many cows to give when you are married? This is the kind of things we got to know. But suddenly power was left to us who were in the customary regime. And now we are supposed to be presidents, we are supposed to be prime ministers, we are supposed to be kings, presidents and ministers. But we are not schooled and we are not socialized historically in the civil law. We didn't know constitution, we didn't know the rule of law, we didn't know human rights. And so we started gambling. And that is how most African post-independent governments and states started collapsing. So the violence therein is explainable. It is bad, but explainable. There is an origin, there is a history too. We stop here.